Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the combat zone, where the enemy has only one of four things to say: abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and we surrender. And Nick is cheering in the background.
Yes,
silently.
you got it.
I'm Joe, he's Nick, and we've got quite a show lined up for you tonight. A lot of controversial topics, and including, we're going to have at the top of the hour, Dr. John Robson will be joining us to talk a little bit about D-Day, because as you probably all know, tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of D-Day. 75 years, Nick. There aren't a lot of veterans, of survivors of that particular
and every year we lose more, of course.
Yeah.
Because the average veteran who went ashore, let's say they were 20, is now 95. So, let's face it, in 10 years, they will all be gone.
Yeah.
And this is one of the most significant events in human history. And we'll get into this with Dr. Robson. I don't steal any of his thunder.
Right.
But to put it mildly, it was an event unlike anything the world had seen. And the sacrifices made by nations all over the world to come together and defeat one of the greatest tyrannies the world has ever seen. I mean, let's face it, there have been tyrannies throughout the world history. There's been, the Mongol horde. There's been all kinds of. You had the Clinton years in Washington. I'm kidding. I'm just
the Clinton years in Washington
and the Obama years.
This is a serious topic, Nick.
Yeah, I know, and I'm not trying to make too light of it. But let's face it, we've had all kinds of different groups of people or individuals try to impose their will through force upon large masses of other people. Even as far as the American Revolution, while I never look at England as a tyrannical state in its history, there are certain leaders who kind of behave that way in certain circumstances, King George V being one of them. King Henry VIII was another. But in the long run, Britain has been a force for good, not evil, but there have been black marks in its history. So whenever we have these kind of tyrants running around, they have to be subdued. And since logic, reason, and negotiation don't often work with tyrants, as a matter of fact, it's almost never been the case, sometimes you have to, that's why the old saying is you have to keep your sword sharp. Keep your shield iron strong and keep your sword sharp, because someday you're going to have to use it in defense of yourself or your neighbor. And that's been true throughout human history.
Well, as Ronald Reagan and many other people pointed out, the best deterrent to a war, the best way to keep the peace, is to have a strong military.
Well, there was a saying in the American military, in the training films that you and I watched when we were in the Navy, it said peace through strength. Peace
through strength.
Yep, and it's quite right. It's like, look at it this way. Chuck Norris does not have to worry about being attacked while he walks down the street.
True
Anybody
enough.
who messes with old Chucky is in for a tough time.
True enough.
There's also, so you don't have to, it's not that you go around beating everybody up just because you can. It's that everybody knows you could if you antagonize them. And that's the important part.
Okay, so the number to call if you want to join the conversation live, toll free anywhere in North America, 844-415-2115. That number again, 844-415-2115. We don't get a lot of calls, but we do get them from time to time, and we do welcome them. And, of course, we always have a very active comments section on our live webpage as the show goes on. And I would just remind you that if you're putting comments in, from time to time, you have to refresh the comments page, and there's a little link at the bottom of the comments that says, and I'm quoting, refresh comment list. So click on that from time to time. You'll get the updated list of comments from the various participants as the show goes on. And as I said, we actually have a pretty lively comment section as the show goes on, Nick.
Hey, you know what's interesting about that?
People tend to want to do it anonymously through the comments rather than calling in.
Well, the other thing is that a lot of times what I've noticed over the course of the shows, different shows we've had, is there's almost like a little community, and they a lot of times will comment on different things going on the air that you and I talk about, but sometimes they develop their own conversations.
And then they have their own conversation going on while we're talking about
Exactly.
stuff, and they're just ignoring
But
us.
but that's the whole point, though, is to stimulate conversation.
Right.
And whether they're talking about what we're talking about, they start out that way, but a lot of times they'll drift into something else that probably is at least as important. So,
well, I am happy to be a communication nexus for this particular community.
yeah.
Even if they're not talking
I
about
know
what
where
we're
you got
talking
that
about.
word, but I'm not going to spill the beans.
No, I actually, I know what you're going to say.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not going to spill the beans either, but that is not where I got that word.
Okay.
That is actually what it is, a communications nexus. Anyway,
right.
We're happy to be facilitating people speaking to one another, or I should say typing to one another, as I always tell my kids. Okay, look, let's get into it. We have a number of topics we wanted to go over tonight. And I think the first one is, I don't know if I'd call it the most controversial, but I think it is controversial. And that is the report that was just issued, not issued by the federal government, but it was received by the federal government by a commission on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
And girls.
And girls. Although I don't recall seeing that, but
well, that's the
was
acronym.
That part of the actual
That's part
title?
of the that is the acronym.
Okay.
missing W.
Okay, so girls and women.
Girls
so
and women.
I stand slightly
Women and
corrected,
girls,
but you all get the point. Now, the genesis of this, Nick, was that there are in some of the cities, and I think particularly in Winnipeg, although I stand to be corrected on that, there were a number of cases of missing Indigenous women over the years. And I don't know how many, but enough where there was a concern that was raised about it, and a concern raised whether or not the government and the law enforcement agencies were doing enough to find these women. And there had been a number of murders as well. And so the government decided to initiate a study or a commission,
a panel or a commission,
to look into this problem and to report back on whether or not it was a problem in the first place or is a problem, and to make recommendations on what can be done in order to address the situation. So the report has now been issued, and there are a number of recommendations in it, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I think that, from my perspective, I want to look at this from 30,000 feet for a bit anyway, Nick. And there were two things that jumped out at me. The first thing was that the report refers to this particular situation that Aboriginal women have been facing as a genocide. Okay, I have a problem with that on a number of levels. The first thing is, I don't know if people understand where the term genocide comes from. The term genocide was actually coined by a French, I think he was a reporter, French from France, after the Second World War, because there was nothing in the English vocabulary to describe what had happened under the Nazi regime during the war years and leading up to the war years, and particularly in the latter war years, and particularly with respect to the Jews of Europe, the mass murder of Jews. 6 million Jews died. And so the term genocide was actually coined to refer to not that event particularly, but to what happened. And it's been used since then in a few instances, I think appropriately, the Rwandan genocide, where the goal is for a state or people to try to wipe out an entire other people. And that makes sense when you think about the term genocide.
Right.
It's etymology. So I'm having trouble here understanding how simply from a vocabulary point of view you can apply it to this. I'm also having trouble on another level. Being Jewish myself, I don't take offense to these kinds of things. You know, I got a pretty thick skin, water off the duck's back. I don't really care. People can say what they want to say, do what they want to do. It doesn't interest me one way or the other. But, you know, this really, I have to say, it's gotten under my skin a little bit, okay? If I was Rwandan, I'd be thinking, okay, guys, no, it's not a genocide. If I was Armenian, okay, I know this is a controversial topic. Was there such a thing as an Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks in 1917, 1918, 1919?
Right.
Okay, it's a controversial topic, but I can see the case being made for it, okay? I'm not sure that I agree in that case entirely that it's applicable, but I can see the case. But the fact that a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen over whatever period of time of women have disappeared or been murdered, that just doesn't
it doesn't reach the standard. Like, first of all, one of the great sins that we've committed in the last 50 years is to water down the language. The analogy I like to use is to win the Victoria Cross. And I'm using this analogy because tomorrow's D-Day, and we'll be talking about we're talking about the Second World War a lot tonight. But to win the Victoria Cross is the hardest medal on the planet to win, because 9 out of 10 times, if you win it, you die in the process. And whenever you see somebody walking around, and there are there are people who have won the VC who are walking around. When you see somebody wearing that medal, that means they have done something unbelievable to win it. So if we were to go around handing out VCs for everything, you know, for every time somebody exposed to some kind of risk, there are lower levels of medals recognizing heroism or great deeds and things on. But the VC is the high mark, the high water mark. So if we started handing them out, okay, like you get bubble gum out of a candy dispenser, it cheapens it. And we've done the same thing with language. We've taken words such as genocide, such as I was talking about this the other day about the word disaster. Okay.
I saw your Facebook post.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. This idea that a tornado went through a little community just east of the city here, for those of you not familiar with Toronto.
Yeah, I think the word was devastation.
Devastation.
Right.
Look, having some roofs torn off and some trees blown over by an F1, the very smallest of all tornadoes, is, and I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not disrespecting the homeowners. For them,
right,
you know, it's a big deal.
Right.
But it's not devastation. When I think devastation, I think of entire areas absolutely level. Like Fort Mac was devastation. Lac-Mégantic was devastation. What happened in Europe in the 1940s was devastation on a massive scale. So let's not water the language down by using it so flippantly and so lightly that it loses its meaning. And this word genocide not only does that, but it insults the people who suffered a real genocide.
Right.
And that's the part that's got me. And some of the different points they make, this Ottawa Citizen dated, I think it was yesterday, came out and posted the top, what was it, 15 points out of the 237 recommendations this thing makes. This document is 1,200 pages long. 1,200 pages long, 237 recommendations. And they handed it over to Trudeau, and he said, oh, yeah, this Canadian and somebody else said, one of his ministers said, every Canadian has a responsibility to deal with this genocide. I'm sorry, it's not a genocide. It's tragic. I feel for the families, and I think the RCMP and the different investigative bodies let these people down. And if there's problems within the justice system, they need to be fixed.
Absolutely.
But by all means, there is no grounds at all to call this a genocide. Because you didn't go out and round up every single Indigenous person, put them in concentration camps, work them to death, and then kill them.
And was that the intention? I mean, if somebody abducts, rapes, and kills an Indigenous woman or anyone, is their intent to wipe out the entire race? I mean, it's absurd on its face. And, I'm glad you pointed out, Nick, of course, we're not it's hard, it's a difficult topic for us to talk about without sounding like we're disrespecting the victims of crime. But look, the law enforcement agencies, okay, we pay them to enforce the law, to investigate crimes, to find the perpetrators, to bring them to justice. If they're not doing that, then that's where the problem is. This is not an endemic cultural problem. This is a problem of the police not doing their jobs properly. And I hate to say that because I don't want to sound like I'm disrespecting the police and law enforcement, but the reality is, okay, if you're not investigating these crimes and bringing the perpetrators to justice, then something has to be done there. If there's a problem, okay, if there's a problem, that's where the problem lies. Genocide, come on, guys. Really,
something?
Come on.
This is the kind of thing that makes, because if you and I are outraged by this comment, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe a lot of Canadians are. Because, first of all, Canada is not in the habit of committing genocide in the first place. We do not go out of our way to try to wipe out an entire race. You have to go back to before Confederation in this country to find a real genocide. That's when the Iroquois wiped out the Huron. That was a genocide. But you never hear anybody talk about that. It's because it's history. We can't change it. So what's the point? The same thing with this. When you talk about these kinds of events, you insult everybody who's involved. Including
the victims.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I've said it. I'm going to repeat myself. If the problem is that the investigative forces, whether it be the RCMP or the provincial police or the city constabulary, dropped the ball and it was a racist thing that they just decided, it's just another native, who cares? Okay, that needs to be dealt with. But the 15 points that they bring up don't change anything. Just one of them that just jumped out at me. They want to create, and this is by no means the worst, but create safe and affordable transit and transportation services in, to, and from remote communities to reduce dependence on risky activities such as hitchhiking. Okay, let's think about that for a moment. Not only is that an absolutely asinine thing to say, but who's going to pay for that? Because ultimately, when you come down to the 237 recommendations, that comes with a hefty price tag. So you're adding insult to injury by saying not only are we guilty of a genocide, but now we got to pay to do all this repair that doesn't need to be done.
Well, the people who think that we should have public transportation between a remote Inuit village and the closest larger community, which might be separated by several hundred miles. I mean, they have no idea of how big this country is. And my guess is that the people who wrote this or make these kinds of recommendations, their whole experience is taking public transit in Toronto or Montreal or Ottawa or Vancouver. And if they're going intercity or they're going longer distances, then they fly. And they don't think about what's involved. And I've run into this many, many times when I talk to people about public transit, or in this case, we're talking about, let's call it safe transit, okay?
Right.
And like to point to the European model as something that we can emulate. And I go, no, you cannot emulate the European model here in Canada because Canada is too big and the communities are too widespread.
And it's too bloody cold.
You cannot reach these people in a practical way. It's a very serious problem. But look, let's set aside the genocide thing for a minute, because there's another thing that I think that has been lost in the whole genocide controversy. Okay. And that is, and I don't know if you have it up on your computer screen, Nick. I don't actually have it on my computer here, but this whole thing about this alphabet soup.
Oh, I got
of
that
different
here,
genders. I mean, what is can you read out the alphabet soup?
Here's the alphabet soup. Okay. 2SLGBTQQIA. Now, what that means is, because this is an ever-changing...
Allegedly.
Today it means. So it doesn't mean it'll mean that tomorrow. Where's the bottom of the article? It tells you what. Okay, here's what all that means. So 2SLGBTQQIA stands for, like I said, today it stands for two-spirited, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, queer, there's a comma there, questioning, comma, intersex, and asexual.
Okay,
what the?
I thought this was supposed to be a study on missing murdered Indigenous women and girls.
Right.
So what does this have to do with anything?
Well, first of all, why would you segregate them out of if we're supposed to be all
If you're a lesbian, you're not. If you're is the implication here that if you're a lesbian, you're not a real woman or a girl?
I don't. If you're looking at me for answers, I got none. But think about this: the whole point of having this alphabet soup of people is so that they can be included and normalized within society. That we're supposed to accept this.
But what's the context in this particular report?
I can't give it to you. I don't know. Like, why would you even think about putting that in there? If all you care about are the indigenous people, who cares about the alphabet soup? They're all people. Why break that down that way?
I don't get it.
Neither do I. And this is the kind of stuff that just makes my blood boil, because while these people preach inclusiveness, they're the most divisive people on the planet. They break everybody into little groups. You know that old Caesar had that saying, divide and conquer? How does it not fit here? Who are they trying to conquer, first of all?
Well, I don't think anyone's trying to conquer anyone.
It certainly looks that way.
That would be genocidal.
Yes, it would.
This is ultimately, this is the real problem with the direction and the tone of this report, is that it's a serious issue that's been turned into a Keystone Cops comedy.
Oh, man.
Because of the way it's been written. And there is no fair-minded person, intelligent person that's going to read this and is going to take it seriously. They'll profess to take it seriously because that's the politically correct world we live in now, okay? And there's always this danger that if you say something wrong, that you're going to be branded a racist, a bigot, a white supremacist, a neo-Nazi. But the reality is, Nick, this is a serious issue that needs serious attention. And if whatever the problems are, and I think there are problems here, they need to be addressed. They need to be addressed seriously. And the authors of this report have taken that serious issue and they've turned it into a comedy skit.
It's a three-ring circus. It is absolutely.
They've done a tremendous disservice.
Well, here, look at number 14.
Because sorry, go ahead. You go ahead.
Increase Indigenous representation in all Canadian courts, including the Supreme Court. Now, let me stop and think about this. Are Indigenous people so lowbrowed and unintelligent that they cannot go to law school and become lawyers and end up on the Supreme Court?
Well, what does this have to do with missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Same story. You're not.
And this is the disservice that's been done with this report in the style that it's been written, and the veering off into issues that aren't even tangential to the subject matter. Okay, they're just completely different issues.
You know something?
And for the sake of making whatever political points that people want to make, it's what's happened here is we're not even talking about the issue. Well, we're not looking at the solutions for the real issue. We're not talking about the victims. We're talking about the silliness of the report.
If I was and I know several Indigenous people. Okay, I live near Golden Lake Reserve, and I've met and have relations with several of them. One is a Algonquin chief. Now, he lives over in Pembroke, but be that as it may. The point is that if I was him or if I was a member of the Indigenous community, I would be furious with this, because not only does it insult my intelligence and is racist at its heart, because you have to make all these exceptions because in the way the world works just to make sure they get included. It's like picking the worst kid in school for your soccer team or your football team. You know, the one kid that nobody wants to pick because he can't run. That's this community. So now we have to make exceptions for them. That's insulting on its face.
Well, this is the way they're being portrayed.
That's what I'm talking about.
Right.
But
just to
more than
be
that,
clear. Yeah.
But more than that, you're right. It doesn't deal with the issue. It does it help us find these missing women and girls? Does it help solve the murder cases? No, none of it. So what the heck is this supposed to be? And Trudeau is going to take this and wave it around like some great flag of virtue between now and the election and try to ride that all the way back into the Prime Minister's chair.
And of course, the question, the $64,000 question, the one that's not being asked is, how are the Conservatives going to respond to this?
You know what?
Are they going to walk on eggshells, or are they going to call it what it is? It's you know, because I could see exactly how this is going to play out. If Andrew Scheer or any of his colleagues talks about this the way it really is, okay, calls it the way it really is, as a comedy show that does tremendous disservice to the real victims here, okay, they're going to be called racists, they're going to be called bigots, they're going to be called neo-Nazis, white supremacists, anti-Aboriginal. I mean, you come up with the name, Nick.
Well, and that's the whole point, isn't it? Because the Conservative leadership in this country, for some reason, doesn't have a spine of titanium to stand up to that and bat those accusations aside and say, look, you can say whatever you want, but the truth is this. And this is an insult to Indigenous people in Canada. This does nothing to solve the real problem, which is where are these girls and women that are missing or more. And it doesn't do anything to solve the murder cases, which was the whole point of this commission in the first place. And then because that will go right through the media it'll go like a laser, and people will get that. But for some reason, these guys will run from this like their heads are on fire.
Well, I certainly am considerably worried that may be the case, Nick.
Well, tell me what they've done to stand up to Trudeau in any way other than say we're not going to open the abortion debate.
I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm not going to be too critical of them. I mean, they're trying to walk a tightrope. I understand that. I have my views on what the best response to this kind of stuff is. I think that you have to be much more assertive, even aggressive in your response. And if you do that, people are going to rally to you. And you have to be, you could be a sensible, decent person. And I think you have to be a sensible, decent person to oppose this, to say, look, enough is enough, people. Okay. Enough with this foolish. I hesitate to use the word political correctness because I don't even think it's political correctness. It's a gong show.
This is the ultimate in the Keystone Cops. I mean, look, how can anybody take this government seriously on anything? Because they have so eroded any credibility they ever had, if they ever had any, on the climate, on this, on other topics. They've just thrown it all out the window.
Okay, Nick, we're going to have to go for a break. We're coming up to the bottom of the hour. And just a heads up for people, we like to vary our music during breaks from time to time. And given the fact that we're on the eve of the 75th anniversary of D-Day, our break music is going to be more remembrance, military-oriented. So stay tuned. We will be back in a few minutes here in the Combat Zone on Think Radio.
Okay, folks, welcome back to the Combat Zone. I'm Nick, he's Joseph, and we spent the first half hour, especially that last segment. You know something, Joseph? There's things like this that really, really, really get under my skin.
I could see that. And you know, my blood pressure, I have to rush home and get my blood pressure medication.
I'm telling you, it's enough to make you crazy because, first of all, it's all unnecessary. If the government were to treat people equally, no matter who they are, where they come from, what color they are, none of that stuff, if none of that stuff mattered, then you wouldn't need this commission. You would go after the police. I'm not going to reboil that kettle, but you get what I'm talking about. They would come up with a completely different set of solutions to this problem, and not this, you know, what's good for the government point of view instead of what's good for the country point of view. Anyway, so that kind of stuff, we had quite a conversation between Joseph and I about that. So if you're just joining us, check out the podcast. You're going to want to hear that because, boy, we both had some pretty strong words about that. One of the next topics we want to get into is the idea that, in my mind at least, and you're certainly free to disagree with me, good luck to you, that Trudeau is trying to buy the press. A couple of weeks ago, he announced that, probably more than a month ago now, he announced that he was going to provide newspapers with $660 million to help them survive. Now, first of all, there's a lot of industries the government supports that it shouldn't. And that includes the oil sector, that includes automotive, that includes any private sector business should never be subsidized by the government. It either lives or dies of its own merit. And if it dies, something else will come along. That's a free market. That's the way it works. So they've just thrown all that out, not that they ever believed in it in the first place, and have decided that the newspapers are too important to die. That's code for we hope that they treat us nicely. So we're going to give them all this money 4 or 5 months before an election so they'll write nice things about us between now and then. To make matters worse, because that's a complete undermining of freedom of the press. Make matters worse, we have a gentleman who is going to be on that board, or he's going to be have a representative appointed to that board from the union known as Unifor. And the head of that union is called Jerry Diaz. And I heard him on the radio, and he couldn't understand why people would think that there'd be a problem with having a union on the board who represents workers at these papers decide what papers get it. Because Unifor and many of the big unions in this country are very much against conservatives. So do you think that they're not going to try to influence who gets those dollars and under what conditions they get them? I'm sorry, he has no business being there. This whole thing is a scam. It's trying to buy the press's favor, and it undermines the freedom of the press, because in a democracy, and I'll let you get into this in a second, Joseph, but in a democracy, when you have a majority in the system that we have, the opposition is symbolic because the government has a majority. So the next level of opposition is the press. If the people elected to be the opposition don't number enough to question and to make to hold the government's feet to the fire, then that's the role of that's why they call it the free press, because the press should not be beholden to any government. So that's where I see this as a real huge step backwards.
Yeah, well, I've been listening to a lot of the criticism of this particular program, and, my response is, you're all Johnny's come lately. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the CRTC already controls what different media outlets do and don't do. There's the magazine industry has its own subsidization. The Canadian press, the press pool, is owned partially by the CBC, which we all know is completely at the government teat entirely. I mean, that's how they generate. That's
about
how
$1.6 billion a year.
So, the truth of the matter is that if you take it from that perspective, this particular program isn't actually that much. And I don't think that it's anybody trying to buy off the press, because if you're trying to buy the press off, man, they've been bought off already a long time ago in this country. I think it's dangerous let me make this perfectly clear. I'm not defending it. I think that the whole thing about government funding of the press, I think, is dangerous. I think it's inappropriate. I think it's a massive waste of taxpayers' dollars. The whole thing, I think that the whole Canadian content rules, CRTC, I'm drawing a blank on all of the myriad different programs of regulation and of funding that are out there for the media. And I'm not just talking about, journalists. I think that the whole thing ought to be burned down to the ground. I don't think the government should be involved in this kind of stuff. No, and I'm not, as you know, Nick, I don't consider myself to be a libertarian. I'm a conservative. I think that there's an important role for government to play in a free and democratic society. As I often say, the opposite of liberty, the opposite of tyranny is not liberty. The opposite, notwithstanding what Mark Levin says in his book, right? But the opposite of tyranny is anarchy.
Right.
And so liberty requires law and order. And the right term for it, I like to say, is ordered liberty. So there's a role for government to play in a free and democratic society. And there's a role and the government has to be, I think it has to be strong and stable, but it has to be limited. And this crosses way over the line between what a government should be doing and should not be doing.
Well, you're not going to get any argument out of me. So, I certainly think that the CBC should die a very quick and painless death.
So, well, I don't care whether it lives or dies. I just don't think the taxpayers should be paying for it.
Well, you know what would happen the moment they pulled government funding?
Maybe it would die. Maybe you break it up and
that's
it gets
actually,
sold. Okay?
To tell you the truth, I would prefer, because that was just off the top of my head, but because CBC is so big, when they do ratings in terrestrial radio, they don't even look at the CBC because it's so far out in front of everybody else. It's not even worth counting their listeners because they blow everybody else away. So for the sake of advertising dollars, they don't include the CBC listener because the CBC has a bought and paid for market.
Right.
Now, if they did cut the funding, the CBC is smart enough just to go and undercut everybody else's advertising, and it would kill all the other organizations. So to break it up in pieces, though, and sell it off piecemeal, I think is the best way to deal with it.
Well, could be. I don't know what the solution is ultimately, but I just don't think that the government should be funding any of this stuff. I want to make a comment, Nick, about what you said about free press, too.
Sure.
I think it's important to remember the free press, the idea of press freedom, okay, didn't come from, stopping government interference. I mean, that was true. But remember, freedom of the press actually came about as a means of protecting the right of the press to be biased, to be pro-liberal or anti-liberal, to be pro-conservative or anti-conservative, or originally it was to be pro-crown or not pro-crown, pro-monarchy or not pro-monarchy, pro-king or not pro-king, okay? And so there's a lot of case law where press freedom was developed, so I only throw that in because I don't actually believe that the press necessarily has to be unbiased. So I'm not arguing for an unbiased press.
Oh no, when I said free press, that's not what I was talking about.
I understand that. I'm telling you my point of view.
Okay,
Nick.
I see.
I'm a partner here on this show, remember?
Yeah, that's right. You're on my side. Okay.
Yeah. Well, not always. But it's an important, but it's a subtle difference because it's a subtle but an important difference because a lot of people in our circles, Nick, as you know, complain all the time about they don't want the CBC to be defunded. They want the CBC to be controlled properly so that it's quote-unquote neutral. They see the problem with the CBC, not that it's funded by taxpayers as much as that it's biased, okay? And that's the source of their complaint about the CBC. Now, not everybody is like that, but there are a lot of people in our circles that say, what we need to do is have more oversight of the CBC so that it's providing an unbiased position on things. And I'm going, no, I don't want to control what the CBC says or doesn't say. I don't want to control what any of the press says. I want the press to give us whatever they want to give us. And I'm a consumer. I will choose what I want to read. And if I'm a discriminating consumer, as I like to think I am, I'm going to prefer the press, whether it's television or radio or internet or newspaper or magazines or whatever, that's going to be more neutral. It's going to give me the facts that in as unvarnished a manner as possible. But the reality is, it's really hard to do that.
Well, let me jump in here, because coming from that world in my not so recent past, there's two sides to a news organization. One is the news itself, and the other one is the opinion. And when I said free press, as you obviously understand, I didn't mean free of bias. I meant free of government control. In other words, okay, let's say the CBC survives. Don't sell me this idea that it's all unbiased. Admit your bias. Tell me that you're a social, you come from the left or you come from the right. Then I can make up my mind. Like when Peter Mansbridge would come on and read the news or give an opinion piece, or Pamela Wallen do it for W5 or whatever, you knew they would try to present it in a way that appeared to be neutral. And yet you knew they weren't neutral. Okay? That's the problem I have. Don't put up this curtain and claim neutrality when your bias is sticking out the bottom of the curtain, like somebody hiding behind a curtain with their shoe sticking out. Okay? It doesn't work. So be honest with the listener or the viewer or whoever's consuming your media about where you're pointed. Like the Toronto Star, as much as I love to hate them, I at least respect the fact that they make no bones about coming from the left. Okay, I can live with that because I understand that's their point of view. But when you come at me and say, look, here's, a newspaper and they're unbiased. Well, first of all, the old red flag goes straight to the pole because I'm not unbiased. I have my biases. I'm a conservative, and that's where I come from. So don't think I'm going to give you a socialistic point of view. I'm not interested in neutrality. I'm interested in where your biases lay so I can figure out and take the tilt out of the story and figure it out myself. Now, the news part, the broadcast part, okay, where the guy sits behind the microphone and says, now it's time for the 6 o'clock news. That should be neutral. That should be free of political spin. Just tell me what happened. I'll figure out whether it's good or bad. So if a three-legged horse won the Triple Crown, fine. Tell me that. But don't say that, don't try to put any political spin on it. And far too many organizations do that.
I know, but Nick, it's impossible to have an unbiased presentation, even of the facts.
Yeah, okay, but
there are so many facts out there, okay? Like, here's the thing. When Donald Trump exaggerates things, okay, which he does from time to time, okay, if that's what you're going to report, that's factual. It's nobody's reporting, or very few people are reporting on the good things that Donald Trump is doing in terms of judiciary reform in the United States. I think he's doing some great stuff there. He's done some really good stuff on deregulation. He's done some great stuff on the economy. On the economy, there are things that Donald Trump has done that are really good, and then there are things that Donald Trump has done that are Trumpisms. Okay,
yep.
And I don't mean that badly. It's just this: everybody has their shtick, and Donald Trump has his shtick, and his shtick is factual as well. So when Donald Trump exaggerates something, okay, if you're the editor choosing what stories to report on because you only have a limited amount of time, if you choose, the 5 occasions when Donald Trump this week said something that was exaggerated, okay, as opposed to the other stuff, which is just as factual, your bias is coming out in your choices, even if you're not putting an editorial spin on it. So this is the thing, is I don't believe in an unbiased media. I don't believe that there's such a thing. I think that what ends up happening is you have different media outlets presenting facts, and they should be presenting facts, okay? And if they want to put an editorial spin on them, I don't care, as long as what they're reporting is factual. And then I pick and choose from the media sources. And maybe if I'm a smart guy, and I like to think that I have some intelligence, I'll go to different sources. Like when I read the newspaper, we used to get 4 dailies. Okay. Now, of course, it's all on the internet. So, we read the various, different newspapers and
news
and
websites
not just
and
the
so
wire
on, yeah.
services too. So I read I get the Reuters, feed.
Yeah.
I get the AP feed. Okay. So I get international news. So I'll spend, a little while every day in the morning, just sort of scanning through and seeing what catches my attention, what doesn't catch my attention. And I get a sort of a good hodgepodge, of different points of view. Some are left wing, some are right wing. And that's okay. So to me, that's what we should have. We shouldn't be worried about media bias. And I know that wasn't the point you were making, Nick. I realize that. But we shouldn't be worried about media bias, in my opinion. And no government should be subsidizing any media outlet. From strictly a free market point of view to begin with. But the second thing is that there is a real danger. I don't believe that the current Liberal government in Canada is trying to control the media by bribing them. I don't believe that, okay?
Well,
the danger does exist once you put this kind of program in place, that you do have the capacity now to exercise that kind of heavy-handed control over the media.
I'm a little more skeptical than you are. I think that's exactly what they're trying to do. And the papers can say whatever they want to, but the moment they dip their ladle into that trough the first time, they're bought and paid for. Because now, what happens with this, let's call it a subsidy, because that's a fancy word for bribery. If you build your business model on money that is dependent on government subsidies, you are building your castle on sand. Because somebody's going to come along and end those subsidies. Just ask the green energy sector about that. So you have news outlets.
If you could find politicians with the courage to end the subsidies.
Well, we got one who's trying. How well he'll succeed, I don't know. But the bottom line, the point I'm making is that once you dip into that trough and you start to build your business model based on that money, because you show me the accountant that's going to be able to turn down $50 million to a newspaper's bottom line, I'm sorry, they're pretty few and far between, because they're not politicians. They're not editorialists. They just are bean counters, and their job is to make the paper profitable. And if money comes in the door, and if they have to dip a ladle into a trough to get it, they'll do it, because that's their job. So when that happens, now you have set yourself up for a huge fall, because if the government, once they get them addicted, it's like getting addicted to a drug. You say, let's say 5 years from now, if the Trudeauians win, they can say, oh, well, we didn't like that policy piece you ran last week. I hope nothing bad happens to your funding.
Right. And, I don't see that kind of threat happening, although the potential is there for it, which itself is
I don't even want to give them a chance to go down that road.
Okay. Well, sure. Exactly. But I think that it's potentially a legitimate fear that recipients of this kind of subsidy would have. And so I could see where some of the media outlets would self-censor. They would tone down their criticism of the government. And remember, not just the Liberal government, but any government. Okay? And, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. If the Conservatives form a government this fall after the general election, okay, it's nice to complain about the head of Unifor being on the committee that's going to figure out how they're going to allocate these funds. That's a specific complaint, but I've stayed away from that complaint because for me, that's getting into the weeds too much. For me, the whole program is a problem, and I think that the criticism should be focused on the program, not on the details of the program. So, as I say, the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, and I can't wait to see whether or not a conservative government under Andrew Scheer or any other leader. Not that there's another leader going into the election, but I can't wait to see what they're going to do, Because remember, we had 10 years of conservative government under Stephen Harper, and they did nothing. Nothing. They cut some of the funding for CBC, okay, but they didn't really take an axe to CBC funding. They didn't fundamentally reform the CBC. And as for the rest of the spider's web of regulation and regulatory bodies that are involved in determining content, licensing, funding, etc., they did nothing. And I think to their detriment, to be perfectly frank. But
I look, on that score, I agree with you. If Andrew Scheer forms a government and he doesn't at least put an end to this fund, at least, then it's an exercise in futility. In other words, he's bought into the idea that now I'm controlling the press, and I'm going to get good favor out of the press because I can pull their funding if they don't. If they don't start being nice to me. The temptation for that would be pretty strong. And it would take a man with great character to say, I don't care about that. I'm going to kill this because it's the right thing to do. And I would certainly hope that he deregulates the news industry in Canada by removing the blocks to new and upcoming organizations online or in print who disseminate information. And instead of... Go ahead.
I'm not entirely hopeful.
Neither am I.
This is not directed at the Conservative Party. This is a general comment. Here we are now talking about this digital Bill of Rights. And just this week, Dr. Robson is going to be on at the top of the hour after the break, and he'll be talking about D-Day. But the reality, one of the things, if I'm not mistaken, he was doing this week was testifying before a committee,
Human Rights and Justice Committee,
on the whole question of internet hate and regulating the internet. So, there's a very real push on this stuff. And today, Google announced that they were going to be taking down hate videos and videos that are discriminatory that they find on YouTube. Okay, and it's hard to object to that, except but that whoever's controlling it has a particular definition of what constitutes hate and discrimination.
Same thing I was going to say.
And so it's very subjective. And it's very easy to go from I want to stop the dissemination of hate to I am basically controlling what points of view are out there, and that's not the intent. I'm sure. I mean, I'm giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, but it's a very slippery slope, and you've quoted him many times before. Nick, I don't recall who it was either. We should look up this quote because we should know it. It's a famous one, right? I don't agree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. And Nick's looking it up now.
Of course.
And so this is a good time for us to take our next break. Just looking at something on the time here. Okay, so yes. It's time for our break.
Voltaire said it.
It was Voltaire that said it. Okay.
Yep.
I thought it was. Okay, Nick. Top of the hour. We're going to take a bit of a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes with John Robson. Okay, it is the top of the hour. Actually, it's a few minutes past the top of the hour. We were listening to a really beautiful rendition of Amazing Grace. Of course, if you're listening to this on the rebroadcast on the podcast, that music has been cut out. But we just wanted to change things up a little bit, given the fact that it's the 75th anniversary of D-Day tomorrow. And so we wanted to have some nice music that was apropos to the theme of remembrance.
Did you know that a little piece of trivia, that song is the most widely played song in human history?
I didn't know that.
It's played, if I remember the statistic right, 10 million times a day.
Wow.
It's just amazing in its reach, pardon the pun. Now, I wanted to correct a quote we were talking about before, and the quote was, the actual quote goes, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Now, I thought it was Voltaire that said it, but it's from a book called The Friends of Voltaire, written by Evelyn Beatrice Hall, and she writes it in the book. So it's not Voltaire, it's Evelyn Beatrice Hall. That's who the quote is actually attributed to. And a lot of people, understandably, because Voltaire was quite the intellectual for his time. And he did say some pretty amazing things, but that's not one of them. That's not his quote.
Okay, Nick, we've got John Robson on the line. So
joining us this evening joining us on the phone is John Robson. He is a commentator with the National Post, with CFRA. He's the executive director of Climate Discussions Nexus. He is a PhD in American physics. He has a PhD in American history. Welcome to the show, John. Appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, we've only got a few moments, so let's take advantage of the time and let me get right to the we all know that tomorrow is the celebration, 75th anniversary of D-Day. If you can just quickly kind of set the table for us, what were these guys facing the night of June 5th and into the 6th, the early hours of the 6th? What was ahead for them?
They were facing a horrendous battle, which they had to fight not from properly prepared positions, but coming out of landing craft without the support that soldiers normally need. And in order for D-Day to succeed, it wasn't enough to get onto the beaches and overcome those defenses, terrifying as that task must have seemed. I mean, in everybody's mind, they must have been going over, what do I need to do in the first 5 minutes, including not get shot with the entire beach, a maelstrom of flying metal and explosives. But you've got to get sufficiently far inland that you can bring in the support, the logistics, the food, the water, the communications equipment, the trucks, that you've got room to absorb a counterattack. And by the end of the day, the Allies had put something like 175,000 men ashore, and they had established a rear area. They'd created these harbors. They need fuel. Modern warfare is enormously fuel intensive, as well as taking huge amounts of ammunition. And they'd succeeded against one of the best armies the world has ever seen, that knew they were coming and had had months, years to prepare their positions. And that is an astonishing achievement, including, I knew somebody who was the intelligence officer for the Stormont, Dundas, Glengarry Highlanders on D-Day, Reg Dixon. And he said somebody needs to write a sort of logistical history of D-Day, because as somebody whose job was to keep track of everything for the colonel of that regiment, he appreciated just how much detail as well as courage went into June 6, 1944.
Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop. That's what has to happen. These guys hit the ramps drop, the landing craft hit the beach, the ramps drop, and let's talk about the Canadian situation. What are they facing?
Well, the big picture is they've got one of the 5 beaches. There are 2 American beaches, then British, Canadian, British. If any of the beaches is not taken on D-Day, the invasion fails. So the Canadians have been entrusted by their allies with a task they must accomplish. And of course, it's better than Dieppe. The beach is more friendly. It's not a bunch of slippery stones. It's reasonably flat sand. But it is a killing field of fire. The Germans have all these positions prepared. And mighty as the bombardment was, it was left a surprising amount of stuff intact. And they've got to keep moving. You're sprinting across the sand in order to reach cover, which is a 19-inch high broken stone wall. You've got to remember where you are, what you're meant to be doing, who you're meant to be doing it with and how, and you've got to keep getting inland to such a point that you've got a defensible position with a usable rear area. And most of these guys had not been in combat before. It's all fine and good to have training, but this is the real thing. This is the first time you're going to see buddies being blown to bits and all the gore and horror and agony of war. And in the middle of all that, you've got to not just do your job, you've got to remember what your job is. And this is an extraordinary tale, I think, of what you would call ordinary, at least normal people, doing very extraordinary things, including, and again, I'm going to mention Reg again because I knew him. Here's a guy who was a captain by this point, who went through the whole of the war, was involved in the operations in the Netherlands, never fired a shot in anger. Reg's whole job was to be shot at while radioing people and saying, could you please tell me where in this, that, and the other you actually are? And do you have any idea where the Germans are? Because it's really important that we figure that out.
Yeah, that would seem kind of critical. Now, when it comes to objectives on day one, the word that everybody knows is that the Canadians took Benny-sur-Mer. They were the farthest inland. What kind of opposition did they face? I mean, were these old men and boys on bicycles? Were they SS? Who were they facing?
It is sort of a combination of regular troops and SS, but it's interesting. Some of the German defenders on D-Day were the so-called White Bread Brigade, I believe, because they had their digestion wasn't very good. And you're thinking, oh, well, here's a bunch of guys who can't even eat rye bread. But there's nothing wrong with the rest of them. And they were facing people who were very determined soldiers, although also some, I mean, there are stories on D-Day of German units who are just kind of sitting around looking at their fingernails until they can run up the white flag because they know the war is over and they've gotten rather tired of Hitler. But the Germans were among the best troops in the world. I mean, the subsequent fighting in Normandy at one point, it starts to look like World War I, including in terms of the rate at which Canadians and others are taking casualties against very determined defenders who are particularly good with their mortars, apparently, and have the 88, the best artillery in the world at that time. Lethal anti-tank, anti-personnel, and anti-aircraft gun.
It's been called the anti-everything gun, yeah. Yeah,
so it is a horrendously difficult task, which was done as would be by Canadians, with remarkably little complaining or boasting, but with lethal effectiveness.
All right, so that's day one. I want to, just because of our time constraints, I want to move on to the war in general, maybe the role we played in that, and how the war has changed our culture since then.
The Canadians played a vital part in the war, and again, the number of people whose contributions were invaluable. The Battle of Britain, such a close-run thing that without the Canadian pilots, I think it would have been lost. The same is true of the French and the Poles, who escaped the wreck of their own countries and determined to fight on. I think our single most vital contribution was actually the Battle of the Atlantic. Without the Canadians on escort duty and in merchant ships, and without the Canadian food and energy, I think Britain wouldn't have made it through the second year of the war and into the third. So that's absolutely vital. And I think after the war, Canadians knew that they had done something extraordinary, that they had taken their place among the nations of the world. Again, there are 5 beaches. We've got one. The Americans, with 10 times our population, have twice as many, including Omaha, which everyone knew would be the worst. And the British have got 2, the whole British Empire. So we knew that we'd been given a job that must not fail and that we had performed in exemplary fashion. You can yap about how long it took to close the Falaise Gap, but I feel that unless you have personally beaten Hitler's finest troops, you shouldn't be too censorious about the time it took fighting in those awful Normandy hedgerows to get that one done.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so with the war now behind us, World War II, the impact on our culture we've gone over. What about the impact of war in general over the course of human history? What kind of impact does that have on the way cultures develop?
Well, I think for most of human history, chronic low-scale warfare is taken for granted. But there are certainly events like the Mongol conquest of Russia that mark a people and a culture profoundly. The Russian feeling of a need for security in an exposed position on the steppes is very strong because of horrible historical experience. And I think that the entire Western world was thrown into terrible confusion by World War I, that this idea of progress and Christian civilization and industrialization and the march of knowledge should have led us into this horror that we could not stop, led to a real surge of nihilism, of relativism, of doubting that there is such a thing as truth, which I think World War II partially, but only partially corrected. I think the West, the long shadow of the Somme still falls over our civilization, despite the fact that kids in school have no idea what it was. But World War II helped. It was a good war. It worked in the sense that we defeated Hitler. We held Stalin at bay, though we didn't defeat him. I mean, again, the war was started over Poland because we didn't fight over Czechoslovakia, and both those countries got stuck behind the Iron Curtain. So there was perhaps a certain note of sobriety about what can be accomplished, but also a feeling that, yes, we can do things, and yes, we Canadians are as good as anybody in the world at the things that really matter.
In the time that we've got left, John, let's talk about some of the places or some of the things people can do to really understand the scope of the Second World War. And I just before I move on to that, I think I'll share this. I think that World War I and Chapter 2 of World War I, World War II, because that war was, I think, a foregone conclusion after the Treaty of Versailles, because of the Treaty of Versailles and the consequences that flowed from it, that this was the first time that the West had seriously been challenged for dominance. You had before that, the English and the French were always knocking about against each other, and you had the Spaniards, but those were by and large Christian nations who were competing for dominance, yes, but had the same basic set of values, and I'm using that term in a loose sense, as the nations they were fighting. In this particular case, you had a whole new paradigm to deal with, and it really rattled the bones of the West, if I could use that phrase. But I wanted to get some input from you about some of the resources that are out there. Like, would you recommend people watch the movie The Longest Day, for example?
Yes, regrettably, it totally overlooks the Canadians. Other than that, it's a brilliant movie, which does, in fact, rely upon eyewitness accounts. Virtually everything in that movie really happened, including at Sainte-Mère-Église, coming up to the 75th anniversary. They have actually hung a dummy parachutist from the church to represent the guy who in the movie, gets shot in the foot and then he has to play dead up there with the bells in his ears. That's a real story. So is the guy parachuting down the well. So is Robert Mitchum's speech inspiring the guys on Omaha Beach, although it was they changed who gave the speech, but it's remarkably historically accurate. I also very much recommend George Blackburn's trilogy, Where Are the Guns of Normandy, The Guns of Victory. Frank Curry's book about being in a frigate in the North Atlantic, I think, is an excellent resource. You read a general history of the war, too. Saving Private Ryan, I think the first half hour is very good on the hell of combat and just how much metal was flying around the beach. After that movie loses the thread, and I wouldn't pay too much attention to it, to be quite honest. Paul Johnson's Modern Times, a great history of the 20th century. If I'm allowed to plug my own The Great War Remembered, you can find that documentary on YouTube. I like Sink the Bismarck. I think that's a charming movie made on a budget of, £3, 8 shillings and sixpence, during the war, about this critical need to stop this German battleship. Midway, which let's not forget that we're in the anniversary of the Battle of Midway as well in 1942. 7 months after Pearl Harbor, an outmanned, out-equipped, ragtag American force defeats the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy. Do not mess with the West, people. It is not a good idea. There's just so much out there. And I think that the other thing is just, imagine yourself in the landing craft and think to yourself, never mind would I be the great hero. When that ramp went down, could I have gotten up on my shaking legs and run out into the water, or would I have cowered there helplessly paralyzed by terror? Because all these guys, not just on D-Day, but it stands in for it. When the landing craft gate opened, they had a job to do, and they got out and they did it.
Now there's one more movie I'll suggest, and that is I just found it here on IMDb. It's called Corvette K255. It's about a Canadian corvette during World War II, and they actually engaged the Canadian Navy to make this movie. They send cameramen to sea to record what it was like life life was like on a Corvette during the ocean. They show the heavy waves, how heavily these Corvettes, the old saying was they would roll in a heavy dew. And the captain of the ship is played by Randolph Scott, of all people, and Robert Mitchum is in it as well, which is remarkable considering the level of quality of the actors. And it really, I've seen it once. I can't seem to find it again on YouTube or any other place, but I'm telling you, it's really worth the time to try and find. It was made during the war, that's true, and there's a fair amount of propaganda, but how many movies do you know about that even mention Canada, never mind focus on it?
Yeah, I mean, why would you call it propaganda, right? You're fighting Hitler, right? There's nothing you can say about Hitler that is over-the-top criticism,
true.
Right?
That is a very good point. One other movie worth watching.
He's the Sauron villain. If you made him up, people would say it was too unrealistic, but he was real. And that's the other thing. I mean, the war ended, in my parents' lifetime. Today, for kids, it's like the 100 Years' War. But it was fairly recent. And that's the other thing people should remember, that heroism is not a thing from history books. Heroism is a thing that ordinary men and women do when the circumstances demand it. And that was certainly true in 1939, as Spike Milligan, after the Battle of El Alamein. His comment was, "Gad, had we ordinary layabouts really beaten the mighty German army?" But I think that's an excellent epitaph for the whole war. Had we ordinary layabouts really beaten the mighty German army? And the answer is yes.
All right. With that, John, I have to let you go. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, or this evening, I should say. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always, and I hope that you'll come and join us again.
Thanks for having me on the program.
The pleasure was ours.
Okay, so that was Dr. John Robson on Skype. So it sounds a little metallic. Listen, I got to tell you, you guys are talking about The Longest Day, which was a great war movie. But I want to make two observations. First of all, in my view, the best war movie ever made was A Bridge Too Far.
Oh God!
I really liked that movie. And by the way, both A Bridge Too Far and The Longest Day were based on books by the same author, Cornelius Ryan.
Now, the thing about A Bridge Too Far, it is my family's favorite of all my older boys who are, really enjoy action movies. All of us agree with you that is the best war movie ever made, other than Kelly's Heroes, although for completely different reasons. But the thing about when the British make a war movie, there's a distinct difference between when they shoot one and when the Americans shoot one. The Americans tend to follow a particular character through his experiences. Saving Private Ryan is a classic example. Hacksaw Ridge is another one. There's all kinds of movies. The story of Audie Murphy. Okay, the way the Americans tell a war story is they follow an individual. The British do it completely differently. Whether it's Sink the Bismarck, which is another one of you gotta see movies. It really was well done, given this. And Judge, I think that John was having a little fun with the budget size. I think it was a little bigger than that. But the point is, given the resources they had at the time, it was a remarkable movie. And there's one scene in it where it shows why destroyers should never play catch with a battleship. You have to watch the movie to see the scene. But anyway, the British, they tend to tell the whole story with no regard to an individual person. So if you take Bridge Too Far, it's about the event, not the people. And the best line in that is given by Anthony Hopkins when he's standing on the rooftop and the Germans...
Yeah, I know where you're going. It's not Anthony Hopkins. It was the guy, it was his second in command.
Yeah, but he tells them. Oh, you're right. The line isn't given by him, but he gives them the order to say the line. And
but he doesn't give them the words.
No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
The word that's I guess what the point is. When the British are asked about surrender, there's this young German private comes across with this flag and says, "My general sees no reason for this continued bloodshed. He would like to discuss terms of surrender." And Anthony Hopkins
obviously asking the British
precisely.
to surrender.
Right.
Because they're surrounded and
there's no way they're going to win this.
Right.
That's right. So Anthony Hopkins, in traditional British fashion, tells his Batman, his second in command, tell him to go to
hell.
Right. So the guy goes, "I'm sorry, we're not equipped to take you all prisoner. We don't have the facilities to take you all prisoner. Yeah. Will there be anything else?" And I still think to this day that they did not tell the actor who played the British soldier with the flag what the response was going to be, because the look on his face was complete and genuine surprise and perplexion. Like, what?
Yeah, I don't know whether that was actually accurate, but if you go on YouTube, now his name escapes me. Was it Colonel Frost or Colonel Long? I can't remember. But the guy that Anthony Hopkins plays, the officer.
Yep.
Okay. There are a number of YouTube clips with him talking about his experiences during the war years.
Right.
Okay. The actual guy, but I don't remember them actually. I haven't come across anything where they actually
said that.
Discuss that. I want to say, also talking about war movies. Okay, Nick, the most realistic combat scene that I've ever seen on film was the landing scene on the beaches in Saving Private Ryan.
No question.
And I remember when I saw that, it was very intense. And I said, I have to bring my kids to see this movie just to see that scene, that they could get from the safety of where they are, a sense of just how intense real combat is.
Oh, look, it's that 20 minutes is worth the price of admission. And look, it's an interesting story, so you can watch the whole thing. And it's, there's a lot of realism in it when it comes to the combat. There's a few little diversions they take, but in general, the way that was it, who is that shot that? Who made it? The director. Oh, he's a huge. I can't think of his name. Tom Hanks and
Steven
Spielberg.
He
was the other guy. He was the director of that movie, and they would often stop and say, "You remember how they did that in the black and white series called Combat?" They would go back to that series and draw examples from that and incorporate that in the movie. But anyway, the point is that it was remarkable. But I think that going back to the differences between the British and the American style in the Battle of Britain, which is arguably another one of the great war movies of all time, it's the same thing. They have, look at the actors that are in it. Christopher Plummer, his character doesn't live through the movie. Okay, there's, and I know I'm leaving out people all along the line that I shouldn't be, but I can't bring all the actors to mind, but all the major players, some of them don't survive. The obvious ones do, like, what's his name? The head of the fighter command at the time. Dowding. He obviously survives and so on. But
yeah, Laurence Olivier played him.
Yes, and did a masterful job. I mean, he captured Dowding's essence. But anyway, the point is, it didn't matter. The roles were cast, and if the character died in the historical event, he died on film. And there's a lot to be said. You could point to the effects used in that movie. I mean, they shot the same German bomber down about 14 times. But, so it was made in 1960 something.
Sometimes in the same sequence.
Yeah, really. There's a German, I think it's a Henkel. No, that would be the Dornier. The Henkel was the pencil. Anyway, they shot that thing down about 14 times. But they even have in it a little nod to the Polish with say again, please.
Right.
That's not exactly the way it happened. And there's another more recent excellent movie about the Poles called Hurricane. And if you want to get a real understanding of the Battle of Britain, watch that.
Okay. I guess we're going to have to go for another break, Nick.
Sounds that way.
That segment.
Because I go on about war flicks for hours.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll be back in a few minutes here in the Combat Zone on Think Radio.
Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. We've been having quite the lively conversation this evening. We've been doing some remembering and thinking about the veterans who stormed the beaches of Normandy 75 years ago tomorrow. So take yourself back. Imagine you're 19 years old. You got a rifle on your shoulder and a pack on your back, and you're in a landing craft, or you're in a troop ship ready to mount. In a few hours you're going over the side of the troop ship into a landing craft to be part of the largest invasion in history. How many 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds today do you think could do that? Well, there's obviously some who could, but it was a tough generation that did that. All right, I don't want to get too far down that road. We've gone over that plenty. Oh, and one more really good movie that you want to see if you want to help understand the experience of World War II, and that is the latest version of the movie Dunkirk. That's a brilliantly shot piece. Anyway.
I'm not sure I liked it that much.
Oh, I loved it. I absolutely loved it. It took me a little bit to get the hang of the timelines and how they were different, but it showed all three elements and the way that they supported it. The dogfight in the Spitfire without fuel was a little bit of a stretch. I'll give you that. But for the rest of it, I thought it was excellently done. And personal choices, right?
Of course, totally.
Yep. Anyway, on to other things, because there are other
Another
things.
Controversial issue to discuss.
Oh, my God. This never ends with this government. Wouldn't it be nice to do a show and say, you know what? The government didn't screw up today. The government didn't do anything wrong today. They didn't stick their foot in their mouth. They didn't try to drag a good man through the mud. They didn't fire people they shouldn't have fired. They didn't hire anybody they shouldn't have hired. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, you see, you're too partisan, Nick.
You know what?
It's not just this government. It's governments in general.
Well, I wasn't saying it's just this government. Just to do a show.
I hear you.
Just to do a show that, you know what? All's well with the world. And tell jokes all night. Play music all night. Just once. And then we can get back into the mud the next week. Right. Anyway. Okay.
And this is getting into the mud.
Oh, is this ever getting into the mud? First of all, before I announce what the story is about, if you haven't already figured it out, there are so many places to spend money in this country. Everything from veterans to people who have mental health issues to seniors to the military. All of them are starving for cash. So starting next year, Trudeau and his government commit to sending $14 billion, that's with a B, over 10 years, $1.4 billion a year, for abortion services. Now they couch it with a bunch of other things like education and health care. But you know that the lion's share of it, 80% of it or so, is going to go for providing abortion services in countries, overseas. $14 billion of our dollars.
Some of these countries don't even allow abortion. It's not a legal procedure in some of the countries that end up getting some of this funding. It is so outrageous.
Because when you think about it, look, I don't normally get into, okay, there are organizations out there. Let me do it this way. There are organizations out there who work with veterans struggling with PTSD, not just from Afghanistan, but from our time in the Balkans. And there's going to be, because we understand PTSD so much better now and can recognize the symptoms and help people get through this through this challenge to try to live a normal life afterwards. A lot of them do. They go on, they recover and go on. But for those who struggle with it, a lot of them, it leads to suicide. And that's no way to treat the people who we've asked to go and do some of the most terrible things one human being can do to another in our government's name. Okay, like when the government picks an enemy, it doesn't matter who it is. The soldier's job is to go and eliminate that enemy. So when you look at this money going overseas, it's enough to just make my coffee boil without a pot. I mean...
and without even getting into the subject of what the money's going for.
Yeah. You know what? It doesn't matter what it's going for. That's a good point. It doesn't matter why he's doing it. This isn't the first time he's done it. He spent $250 million in foreign countries that had no business leaving the country. We've got too many things going on here that we need to deal with. Yeah. I mean, look, they just built a brand new ship for the Navy. It's called a coastal patrol vessel or a Arctic patrol vessel, and it's named after our greatest sailor, Harry DeWolf. And I think it's the ugliest looking ship I've ever seen. I think it's embarrassing. They picked it to give to the DeWolf family because, for those of you who don't know the name Harry DeWolf, he was captain of HMCS Haida, our single most successful warship ever floated during World War II. You should have given him some kind of surface combatant, not a glorified tugboat. But they've already discovered cracks in the welds and have to haul it back into dry dock to fix the welds. We have problems. That's just one area. And even if you like, go and talk to seniors, who need access to in-home services. Now, I understand this may be provincial, but you could include it in transfer payments. You could, all kinds of things you could do with it other than send it overseas.
Well, I heard today that the federal government was pledging somewhere around $15 or $16 million to reinstate the tree planting program that the Ford government had canceled in Ontario. So certainly in Canada, federal governments have not been shy about wading into areas of provincial jurisdiction to enforce or to implement a particular policy area that's important to them.
Unless it's the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
But seriously, Nick, I quite apart from the general topic, the general criticism that you have, which I think is very valid, the question, of course, is where is this money going? And it's I have to confess to you that I feel a little ashamed that our tax dollars, our government, is taking our tax dollars and sending it overseas to kill or aid and abet in the killing of unborn babies. I think that that's unacceptable, and or birth control. Now, I have far less objection to birth control than I do to abortion, but let's not sugarcoat it. That's what we're talking about here, and this was something that the Harper government, I think, got right. It was not easy, and it was somewhat controversial even within the Conservative caucus and government circles at the time. But the idea of the Harper government was that money that was going towards, money that was going allocated to go overseas to help with women's health was specifically designated to go towards things like nutrition and neonatal care, etc. In other words, life-giving, life-sustaining initiatives as opposed to life-ending initiatives. And I wish it was true when Justin Trudeau talks about how the abortion debate is being imported into Canada. And I know that you've said that, well, it's a debate. It's a debate. Of course it's a debate, but it's not really a debate here. It's not a serious debate here because we can't get any mainstream political parties to engage in it. And it's really quite tragic that it's almost like the old hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Except in this case, it's hear no evil, see no evil, and speak evil. Now, look, when the mother's health is in danger, I get it. Okay, if you have to choose between the health of a mother and
tragically, yes, I agree with that.
Okay, tragically, of course, but in other cases, I just think that abortion is morally wrong, and I think that our government is wrong to support it, especially to support it and promote it overseas.
Well, first of all, this stuff, like, I completely agree with everything you just said. But when you look at the size of the deficit and the debt, when you look at the needs within our own countries, think about fighting forest fires. They have to call it, in many cases, they have to call it the military to do it. to help with that.
Sure.
Okay, or they have to charter planes to fly people out or whatever it is. There are needs for that money here at home. I'm not saying Canada should stop being charitable. That's not the point. But do so. Look, if you really want to be effective with foreign aid, which is something nobody talks about anymore. When's the last time you ever heard the term foreign aid in a press release or a news conference? They just don't use that term anymore. But if you really want to be effective with it, have people take it on personally and do microloans. Like if there's one of the stories I'm aware of is there was an Afghan woman in Kabul who was given $200, and she opened a little bread shop. And within 6 months, she had the $200 paid off and was running a very successful little bread shop where she made little loaves of bread and sold them every day in the marketplace. All she needed was a little startup capital. It bypassed all the government regulations. It bypassed all the corruption. Like it's the old saying is, people write checks to these despotic countries so they can step over the bodies of their own people on their way to the F-16s. I mean, this is one way to do it. Now, if the government wanted to provide funds for people to access to do that, I think that's far a smarter way to spend money overseas because you do it in tiny little lots. It's accountable and you don't end up writing massive checks that dictators get their hands on and then squander when their people suffer. So there's that. But again, I come home and I say, all right, how many miles of highway could you build on the Trans-Canada between Pembroke and the Manitoba border for $14 billion? That is a death trap. Where that highway ends, out there near Arnprior, all the way to the Manitoba border. If you go from there to Deep River every year, it's almost one a week, somebody dies on that stretch. And I'm only using that just as an example. There are industries crying for help, like the aviation industry. We're running out of pilots. We have to, there's a competition amongst different service groups. Like, and when I say service groups, I'm talking EMS, the military, police, fire. They're all competing for the same bodies. And yet nothing's being done to encourage young men and women to consider these as optional as for careers. Some will choose it anyway, but how many more would there be? There's this tendency to give money to universities when colleges would be far better to train people into more realistic trades and encourage people to get into the trades, and all that money that could go to that. These are just some examples, and I realize I'm crossing jurisdictional lines in a lot of cases, but you know what? I'm fed up with watching our money go out the window with no prospect of return. It's not like they're investing in something we're going to get $22 million back on in 10 years. It's not that kind of thing at all.
Right.
It's
don't
gone.
Even say that because I just don't believe in government investing either.
Fine, but whether they do or not, the money's gone. And regardless of what happens after that, we won't get it back. There's no getting it back. And all we're doing is making it more difficult for our kids and grandkids and their kids to have to shoulder this burden because debt doesn't go away.
Okay. So, but we're confusing a lot of different issues, and I want to bring it back to what I consider to be the real problem of this program. Question number one, it is fair to say that we can't afford to create a brand new spending program in foreign aid when we are running a deficit, because to go it further into debt for any foreign spending, I think is problematic. Okay, so we have programs that exist already. Whether you agree with them or you don't agree with them, they exist. They're functioning. They have a purpose. They're doing hopefully they're doing what they're intended to do. So. But now, even though you're running a deficit, you create a whole new program. So that is a problem in and of itself. In principle, we should not be doing this in the circumstances. Okay, but set that aside for a minute. I'm not against the idea of Canada helping in developing countries. I don't have a particular objection in principle to that, as long as we're not going into further debt. As a consequence of it.
Right.
Okay, because I don't see the value in further indebting our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren possibly by doing these kinds of programs, any kind of program that we don't really need to be doing. But set that aside, as I say, I'm not against Canada helping in developing countries, okay? I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it's part of what we do as Canadians. Where I have a real problem is, as I say, in where this money is going to go. It's not going towards building wells and ensuring clean drinking water.
Right.
It's not going to vaccination of children in order that they don't suffer from the kind of childhood diseases that end up driving the mortality rate up in many of these societies, okay?
Right.
It's going to women's health, which sounds benign enough, but really what that code is, that's code for abortion. Okay, when you talk about women's health and education, you're not talking about elementary school or high school education. You're talking about reproductive education, okay? And so it's abortion and it's birth control. Now, again, there's I think a fair argument about birth control. So we'll set that aside for a minute. But abortion is not something that we should be facilitating. It's wrong. It's morally wrong. And moreover, in many countries where we provide this kind of encouragement and assistance, financial assistance, actually, some of these countries, abortion is not legal. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're undermining the society, the rule of law in the societies that we're claiming that we're helping, which in itself is problematic. I don't know how we got to this stage in Canada, except maybe one thing. Again, I've said it so many times, Nick, and I'll keep on saying it. Politicians in particular, public people, public personalities who have a strong feeling opposing abortion, or at least opposing abortion on demand, should be prepared to speak up and speak out. And unfortunately, they've bought into this whole self-censorship regime in this country. And as a consequence, there's this notion that everybody agrees on this subject. When in fact, if you do polling on it, you find that only a very small minority of Canadians think there should be unlimited abortion on demand.
Where have we heard this kind of logic before? Or not before, but recently? There's another debate that's out there that everybody says, oh, everybody agrees on it.
Oh, global warming.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, climate change.
It's the same logic.
Well, it is.
If I say we all agree on it, therefore we all agree on it. So shut up and move on.
Well, this is it. And, the irony of all of this is that if this stuff is if these are things that we all agree on and the science, quote unquote, is settled, if that was a logical argument, okay, or that the decision has already been made, we've had this debate and move on, we're not going to have it again. Ironically, we wouldn't have abortion in this country because at one point in time, abortion was illegal.
That's right.
And that was the settled law, and that was the settled opinion of society. And it only changed because there were activists who were prepared to turn it into a debate. Now, and they had every right to turn it into a debate. Okay. We wouldn't have same-sex marriage if things were in a democratic society were settled and for all time.
Right.
We'd still have slavery, for heaven's sake. So it's not a logical argument. Nothing in the area of public policy in a democratic system is ever permanently settled. And we should be open to having these kinds of debates. And at the end of the day, we live in a democracy, and governments are going to respond to the will of the people, hopefully. And so, if Canadians want unlimited free access to abortion at all stages of pregnancy, including up to and including up when a child is actually in the process of being born, okay, if that's what Canadians want, then look, it's, in my view, it's wrong. But, you know, we live in a democracy, and that's what the decision is going to be. But I suspect that if you put that kind of a question to the people, they won't agree. So here's my question, Nick, okay? Why would the Conservative Party not agree to introduce legislation, not private members' legislation, but to introduce legislation banning partial birth abortions? At a minimum, ban partial birth abortions. I can't imagine anyone getting up on the dais and saying, no, we're in favor of partial birth abortion.
If you're looking at me for an answer, you're going to be looking for a long time, because there is no logic that you can use to understand that mindset. This is so easy a decision to make that it should go without saying. And yet we have the different conservative pundits, leaders, parties who run from it like rabbits from a fox. It's just crazy how absolutely, and this is why I call them spineless. You know what? Because you're right. If I'll pick on Andrew Scheer because he's the current leader. If he were to stand up in the House of Commons and say, when this party forms government, we will ban partial birth abortion, and then let Trudeau have his conniption fit. And when he's done, Andrew Scheer says, when this party forms government, we will ban partial birth abortions.
Yeah, I cannot for the life of me think that people are going to abandon the Conservative Party because of this.
He would attract all kinds of people he doesn't stand a chance of attracting right now, because he won't do that. The thing about being a leader is you need to lead.
Well, here's the thing. From an electoral point of view, Nick, I don't know if it's an electoral winner, okay? But I do know that it's not an electoral loser.
Well, if you
and the logic that I keep hearing from conservative strategists and tacticians is that talking about abortion means that it's a losing item for us to talk about.
Tell that to all their members who win, who are pro-life.
Well, you're preaching to the choir.
Look at my own MP, Cheryl Gallant. She's very pro-life. She wins in landslides, 3-1. Even when somebody from who wanted to take her place as the Conservative banner, wasn't pro-life, he got crushed. She got 27,000 votes. He got 6,000. Absolutely crushed. And this is why I don't understand why they just don't look at the results of their own campaigns and say who won, who lost, and what was their position on this. And they would be amazed at how many of them are pro-life. Look at Sam Oosterhoff. Well, that's provincial, but look at Sam Oosterhoff. Now, he's taken a beating since then from his own party on top of that. But holy mackerel. You know what? You can't change a culture without displaying some courage.
Well, you can't change a culture without at least allowing some dissent, at least standing up and expressing your dissenting point of view.
Well, that takes courage these days.
It takes some courage for sure. It takes a lot of courage these days.
Anyway, so it's the kind of thing that just it drives me up a wall. And I know it's, you know what, it's a contentious issue and a very emotional one and a very emotionally draining one to talk about because of the content and the topic. Like I don't normally like talking about it because I get so angry about it when I think about what it actually means. You know, when you talk about partial birth abortion and you picture in your mind what happens, it's just so horrific. I don't normally want to spend that kind of mental energy trying to contain my temper. I just get so angry about it. But anyway, but at the same time, you have to be an adult and you have to understand that there's going to be ugly things happen in the world and you have to stand up to them. And this is a real, this from a country who's famous for its courage. And yet, when it happens within our own borders, we don't have any. And it's really distressing.
I don't think there's anything more I can add to it, Nick. It is a very distressing, as you say, subject. But there it is.
All right. Well, before we go, I want to say thanks again to our guest, John Robson. It was always a pleasure to talk to him and have him as a guest on our show. I hope he'll join us again because he's such an entertaining guy to listen to. He's overflowing with facts and figures, and it's a lot of fun to listen to him lay things out for us. And
so tonight, Nick, to close out the show, we usually do the Maple Leaf Forever, but given the fact that this is the 75th anniversary, almost, that is to say, not almost the 75th anniversary, but tomorrow is the 75th anniversary of D-Day, I thought that it would be appropriate tonight if we close out the show with the last post.